Hey everybody, Mike Linville here, founder of Black Dog Education and the developer of the DIY Creator Series. Want to thank you for coming back to this video. Now, this is the first video in our 6-part awareness campaign called Does Your Website Suck? Now, if you took a look at the last video, and I hope that you did, because we kind of talk about the sweepstakes that's running along with this campaign, but if you took a look at the last video, you're going to realize that, we're not creating this campaign in order to make anybody feel bad. The whole idea isn't that we want to point fingers or even specifically tell you if your site is bad or not. What we really want to be able to do here is we want to be able to raise awareness for small business owners in terms of how productive or actually what level of performance they're getting out of their website, right? So what we do is we want to be able to bring a little bit of perspective to the process, right? And that's all we're really trying to do. So in this video, the one thing that I want to be able to talk before we really get into kind of the meat of it is if you're the developer of this site, if you actually are the guy that created the website for your business, or if you were directly responsible for hiring or working with these people, the one thing that I want to ask you to do is I want to ask you to just take a couple of seconds, and when you're going through these video series, don't take it personally. Look, I understand that when you're really close to a project, sometimes it's easy to take things personally, and it's kind of hard to get a little bit of distance and a little bit of perspective. It happens to me all the time, right? I'll come up with these campaigns and I'm like, man, this stuff is genius, and they tank, right? It happens all the time. I mean, that's how you learn. You fail and you learn. So what I want to do is, as you're going through this, especially if you're one of the people that had created the websites, or you were one of the people that was responsible for that aspect of it, I want to make sure that you just take a step back, take your developer or your designer hat off and really kind of step into the shoes of your customer, right? Because if we take a look at what your website is really all about, your website is just a marketing tool, right? It's not something that you can use to tell people, hey, look, I like this color or I like this. Your website is going to be a marketing tool. It's going to help you communicate with your customers when you're not there. That's it, okay? So again, if you're really close to the design, step back, try to take a look at it from a fresh set of eyeballs, a fresh perspective about how your customer is going to be seeing your site. And for those of you that are going to be watching this video series without a website, don't think that just because you don't have a website, this is going to be meaningless information. So basically what's going to end up happening is we're going to go through each one of these 6 different areas of improvement. And we're going to talk about some common problems that people typically see. But we're not just going to say, oh, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. Good luck, Charlie. We're going to talk about the typical problems that we see, but we're also going to talk about the solutions to those problems, right? And those solutions aren't necessarily, that's what we think. Those solutions are all going to be based on best practices, okay? So again, I really appreciate you kind of sticking with us. Now, in this first video, we're going to start talking about design, okay? So let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? I don't want this to be a 45-minute video where we talk about the subtle nuances of design and usability. We're going to consider design and usability in the same thing, because realistically at this level, what are we talking about, right? If you've got poor design choices that you're making, that's going to negatively affect your usability. So we don't need to nitpick and nickel and dime. I mean, look, design is going to be, for the purposes of this, design is going to be design. The second thing that we need to talk about is we're talking about design for the web. Now, design for the web and design for print, those are 2 very different strategies. Those are 2 very different skill sets. Now, I love print designers. I have crazy amounts of respect for them because they do stuff that I would never be able to do in terms of layering colors and doing all that other stuff. But if you've got print designers that are developing your website, I would just say be careful, because again, when you're developing on the web, there are a lot of additional technological issues that we've got to deal with. We've got page load times. We've got, web-safe fonts. We've got all kinds of things, browser issues, different compatibility issues along with that. So there's all kinds of things that are going on that, those subtle nuances aren't necessarily going to be picked up by a print designer. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is, what we're talking about here is generalizations. We're talking about principles, and we're talking about best practices, okay? This isn't going to work 100% of the time for everybody. Some of the things that we're going to talk about, that may absolutely not work for you. And if that's okay, that's okay. It is what it is, but understanding the theory behind it, that's going to be the most important thing, okay? So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Now, the three things that we're going to talk about in terms of design, or the three elements of design, are going to be typography, color, and layout. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about typography. So before we get started, don't worry about the word typography. Basically, it's just a fancy way of saying the fonts that are being used, like an Arial or a Times New Roman. It's just kind of the style of the letters that we're using. Now, back in the late 60s, there was a gentleman by the name of Albert Mehrabian. And if I'm Albert, if you're out there and I'm mispronouncing your name, I sincerely apologize, not my intention. But he put together these studies, and basically the gist of these studies was, it was all about communication. And what Albert found out was, through face-to-face communication, 7% of the information that gets communicated back and forth actually has to do with the words that we use. 38% of the communication has to do with the tonality that's in our voices, and then a full 55% had to do with body language. So, I know what you're thinking right off the bat. You're like, well, man, if 93% of this stuff is tone and body language and we're on the web, we're screwed. There's no way that we're going to be able to help out. Well, that's not necessarily true. When Albert put this study together, it was the late 60s, didn't know about the web by then, but also he was specifically talking about face-to-face communication. But I think that information, even though it may not be 100% accurate for the web, it's important for us to know, because that's really what we're trying to mimic, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to the point where, people feel comfortable enough with our websites as if they were having a face-to-face conversation. So, that's one of those things that we're going to want to keep in mind. Some of the common problems that we see, or that we have seen over the last 13 years in terms of typography, are people using too many or too few different font types. You've seen them. Websites that either look very boring, or websites that have 42 different types of fonts and you just don't even know what to do with them. Another common problem is people using too many colors. You don't need to change every other word a different color. You probably don't need more than 2 colors at the most. And then the third thing is just bizarre pairings. What we're going to talk about in the solutions is we really want you to try to choose 2 different fonts, but you want to choose 2 that kind of work well together. You don't want one that's really big and fat and chunky, and then one that's very dainty. Those are kind of an odd pairing, okay? When you're looking for fonts for your website, choose 2. That's it. You don't need to worry about 7 or 9 or doing this or doing that. That's, print designers do that kind of stuff. On the web, choose 2 fonts, right? We're going to use one that we're going to use primarily for headlines. We want those to be nice and clean and clear and easy to read. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose what's called a sans serif font, right? It's like an Arial or a Verdana. For the body type, what we're going to do is, for that one, we're going to choose what's called a serif font. And the difference between serif and sans serif is, if you've ever seen like the written newspaper, or typically in books and things of that nature, anything in print really, you see those little squiggly lines down at the bottom of M's or at A's, how it kind of goes out a little bit. That's a serif. So when we talk about serif fonts, we're talking about fonts that have those little squiggly lines on them. When we're talking about sans serif fonts, we're talking about more round fonts that don't have the little squiggly lines. That's it, okay? So number 2, what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to assign roles for our fonts, and then we want those to be consistent throughout, right? I mean, the way that the human brain works is we like to be ordered. We like to have things in a certain way, and we like them to be that way all the time. It just kind of makes people at ease. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to say, okay, this is the font that we're going to use for a headline. We're going to use size 14 Arial, whatever the number is, it doesn't really matter. But what we want to do is every place where we have a header, if it's multiple headers on one page, headers on different pages of the site, wherever it's going to be, we want to be able to use the same font, okay, and be consistent across the site with it. Now, the best way to do that is actually through the use of what are called cascading style sheets, or CSS. Now, before you freak out and think that this is going to be some sort of like monster web design class, it's not. What's important is, again, we talk about this campaign being part of it's an awareness campaign, but there's also a sweepstakes that runs next to it. So everybody that signs up for the sweepstakes is going to get an ebook that has all of this information, as well as a quick start guide in terms of like action items. What do you need to do to start taking your business or your website to the next level? So don't worry about it. Don't feel like you've got to take a bunch of notes. We're going to go ahead and send those things out. Just make sure that you sign up for the sweepstakes. And then the last thing that we're going to want to talk about with typography is we want to make sure that we're contrasting not only the sizes, but the weights, okay? So when we talk about size, we're talking about a 12-point versus an 18-point. It's just a slightly larger. But we also want to deal with kind of bolds and non-bolds or italics. The combination of different sizes, different weights, and 2 different font styles, that's going to be plenty to be able to differentiate your site and all the content that's on there, right? By differentiating your content using fonts, what that does is that lets the eye easily go to the things that are important, like your headlines, right? You can easily skim a page and figure out what the headlines are instead of having to read through the same thing, okay? So again, the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be color.